My name is Ginny Bedanes. I'm the director of the Defending Democracy program here at Microsoft, and wanted to welcome you to our Microsoft Innovation and Policy Center. We're going to have a really great conversation tonight between two women who I love and I think so highly of, and really cannot wait to hear their conversation, but of course want to hear from you all as well. So with that, I'll let Allie go ahead and get started.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. This mic is kind of loud, but thank you all for coming. I'm Allie Brandenberger, co-founder and CEO of The Bridge. We started the Drinks and Discussion series last year as a way to promote networking and to get our community together, and also have interesting conversations across tech, policy, and politics. So a lot of you guys are from advocacy organizations, government, public policy, but a lot of you guys are also data scientists and technologists and startup CEOs. So thank you so much for coming and being interested in this intersection. Tonight we are talking with Portia, who is the Managing Director of US Public Policy at Microsoft. So thank you to Microsoft for hosting and for providing food and beverage this time. And with that, I guess I'm just gonna let Portia kind of talk about her career and how she got to where she is, and then we'll get into some questions. And then most importantly, these are really meant to be a conversation with you guys. So if you can think about your own questions. And Ginny, I think, is offered to pass the mic around for Q&A, so we'll get to that as soon as possible.
Right. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's really loud. Let me move it away a little bit. So hi, I'm Portia. I am, as Ali said, I'm here in the U.S. Government Affairs Office for Microsoft, and I lead the federal policy team here. But this is sort of a different role for me. You might say I'm sort of like the, that accidental tech podcast. I feel like accidental tech worker. My background actually is I'm a labor lawyer by training, and I used to represent unions and workers. How I started my career after law school. Interestingly, one of my clients, you may not know this, but this very building is built on what used to be the parking lot of the building for Local 25, HERE, the hotel and restaurant employees, and they were one of my clients. So I used to come here, I represented workers who had been fired or disciplined, and they felt that was unfair. And that was my background, and it's sort of incredible to me, and I sometimes run into my old colleagues in the lobby, and I cannot tell you how incredulous they were the first time I said, I work at Microsoft, and they thought, you, like the person who never learned how to program a VCR? How can you be at a tech company? But I take that as a sign of Microsoft's open-mindedness, inclusiveness, but I also think it's nice to bring a variety of perspectives. And I think as we'll talk tonight, part of what tech policy holds for the future, I think, is not just about what might think of as traditional tech issues, but it really involves a lot of questions about workers, about skills, about opportunity. So I did that for a while. Then I was a staffer on Capitol Hill. I worked for the late Senator Kennedy on his HELP committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and they just went away, on handling labor issues. And I also then went to the last administration, and I was at the White House for a few years at Department of Labor.
You have to sit
I have to sit really straight. I'm not going to move anymore. And at Department of Labor, actually, I oversaw the Employment and Training Agency, which deals with skills issues. So confronting a lot of the questions of what happens to workers when they're displaced. How do we go about training workers for the jobs of the future?
Awesome. So you guys all submitted questions before you came too, so we'll get to some of those mixed with some of my questions, and then, as I said, please be thinking of your own questions because I really want to have a back and forth. But I guess just with your background and kind of how you got to Microsoft, I think one thing that would be interesting to start off with is how did you, if it was so rare for you to come to Microsoft, how did you make that transition?
Well, after the administration ended, I took a little time to think about what I wanted to do, and actually I was very interested in Microsoft all along because I knew it as a company that invested a lot in policy making. really was a long-term player, very thoughtful, believed in engaging with them. I had spoken with people from Microsoft back from my days as a Hill staffer and certainly in my administration days. So I wanted to go somewhere where policy would be taken seriously. And we actually have folks who are dedicated lobbyists in the company as well, but I really get to focus on policy. And I started here with the workforce and immigration portfolio because that was my background. And within about 2 months of getting here, the administration decided to rescind the DACA, the Deferred Arrivals Program. And we decided we were going to leap out on front and we were going to challenge it. And we actually really challenged it. We went to court and sued the administration with Princeton University. And our case was heard in the Supreme Court a couple months ago. So that was a very active beginning for me. And it was exciting because I felt like, okay, I'm doing workforce and immigration. This is an important priority for this company, right? It's not sort of some backwater issue. We are really getting out there. And I really enjoyed being in a company that had that sort of alignment with values and policy and is really thinking about that. I feel super fortunate. Sometimes people ask me, how did you do that? And I think I was sort of in the right place at the right time. But I do
true with a lot of jobs.
Right, exactly. But I do think that, increasingly, a lot of companies, not just tech companies, are really thinking about what is it our responsibility to get engaged with in terms of policy. Maybe it's not just what we would have thought of as a traditional narrow industry prerogative.
So in terms of that, future of work, a huge topic a lot of people are really interested in. I think that's happening too. Both in kind of the startup world, in the gig economy, how tech is impacting contract workers, but also just kind of AI, tech, generally machine learning, how it's impacting the future and what the future of work will look like in terms of labor workers and all that sort of stuff. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what you guys have been thinking about at Microsoft and the trends that you've been seeing?
Sure, and I know you've had LinkedIn come and talk in this series before. LinkedIn is an owned subsidiary of Microsoft, although they operate pretty independently. So a lot of my thinking is informed by their data and what they see. I mean, I think we all know the jobs of the future that will need tech skills won't just be jobs in IT, right? There'll be jobs across fields. The real question is, how do you help people who are today in retail, hospitality, like the folks I used to represent, trucking, whatever the industry is, how do you help them get those tech skills when they're busy working full time, right? They don't have the time. And I think from my time at Department of Labor, I saw this as one of the great challenges, which honestly, we don't deal with very well as a nation. We think education happens at the beginning. It's K through 12, then you go to college, then you go to work. And if there's other training that needs to be done, it's on your employer. Or maybe you do it at night or online. And I do think online learning opens up a whole new world of possibility. But let's be honest, adults learn best when they're doing things in an applied fashion. And so I think some of the trends we're seeing is definitely we know jobs with skills. IT skills have been hot for a long time. Thinking about certifications, something short of even an associate's or bachelor's degree, super valuable, but a lot of people have trouble understanding which one should I pick? How can I figure out what's worth the most to me? I think the question of the cost of higher education is prohibitive for some people, and that's really concerning in terms of equity and participation, because we still see in a lot of IT fields that people still look for that BA degree. We at Microsoft have really been changing that, and a lot of companies have been saying we don't BA or other experience, BS or other experience. We've opened up some apprenticeship pathways to help people become software developers, and sort of feel like if you can be a software developer at Microsoft, like you can really go anywhere. And helping people do that through an apprenticeship, intensive training, on-the-job learning experience. So I think using all those different strategies is super important. As things roll forward, people are going to need skills in data science, in AI and machine learning, and trying to figure out how people get those skills across fields. And frankly, when we think about our principles on AI, how do you think about fairness, equity, transparency? We're going to need people with backgrounds in all kinds of fields in the humanities, philosophy, psychology. So we really need to think about a broad set of skills that we can bring to tech fields.
Okay, so now kind of going to AI, ethics, fairness, we just hosted an event with Facebook actually on AI ethics and had a bunch of AI leaders from around the country come in. And that was just last month. But one of the things that one of them said was fairness is a process. And then he started kind of going through each layer that a company has to think about in terms of thinking about equity or like in building a product, what are the certain layers that you need to think about? And I thought that phrase, fairness is a process, was really interesting because it is on the product side and kind of in development. But when you're thinking about public policy too, and now things are kind of getting so merged, what can be done on that side to make sure that all the reskilling that you were just talking about happens?
So I think there are a couple things. I mean, first, there's making sure that everyone thinks about these fairness and equity ideas as they're developing products or applications. So that may not just be Microsoft, but it's a private sector company that's using certain tools for screening or hiring. It's workforce. It's a federal agency that is using artificial intelligence to try to identify when people may or may not be appropriately applying for benefits. I mean, all these decisions have really consequential impacts, and we really need to make sure that in the design and also in the implementation, people all along are saying, okay, how can we continue to test this? How can we make sure we're not just when we say, does something work? Does that include measuring it for fairness and equity and bias or disparate impacts? And I will say there are existing bodies of law in many fields. So it's not, in housing and employment, we have standards, but maybe some of them need to be revisited, and we need to understand how technology might intersect with that. That's a little different than the question you were asking me, I know, which was about workforce. I do think we need to rethink, and some of the states are looking at this, is how can we help people get skills along the way? And actually, I think some private sector employers are doing a really great job. I know some of our partners that we've talked with, or we know of their great work, like Walmart or others, they're trying to think, we already have ways of skills academies and things we use to train our employees internally. How can we start building in some of these machine learning, data, IT skills that people will need to transition to next generation transportation, retail, healthcare jobs?
So what are some of those examples that you think are already happening, I guess, that people could look to? Because we did have a bunch of questions from folks that are thinking like they're at a smaller company or a mid-sized company, and how can they implement them there, or kind of even get this thought process across that they can't be separate.
So, I think there are a couple things. I mean, it's true. It's easier for a company with 100,000 employees, like AT&T, for example. They said, we're going to kind of help everyone analyze the job they've got today, what jobs there might be in the future, and how they can get from here to there. They have the resources to do that. A small company with 30 to 50 employees might say, I can't do that. And I don't know what the jobs of tomorrow are. I'm trying to fill inventory today. I think the important thing there is you have to look at industry associations. You have to look to community college partnerships. You have to look to state and local leadership to say, okay, what are the trends in our area? What do we see emerging? And that is the job of the public workforce system, to help forecast that. But it's hard. There's a lot of change coming, and no one really knows. I don't think we could have predicted, 5 years ago. How many people do you know now who have jobs managing social media? Like 5, 10 years ago, how many people did you know, right? It's completely changed. So I think that working in cooperation with other companies, with your industry associations, with your community college, really can help. Some of these apprenticeship programs, for example, are run by third-party intermediaries. So we're running a class of 40 people. You might want one for your business, right? But you can afford to pay for that one, but you can't afford to set up a whole program on your own. And we need to make sure those kind of intermediary third-party organizations exist to help everyone get together, because it's a common problem for all of us.
Yeah. So in talking about the problem, I think a lot of people, there's fear obviously drives press, drives clicks, drives everything, so that sells. But in terms of what Microsoft is seeing, like how quickly will this shift happen, or what do you guys think? I guess.
I don't want to say that, because I remember.
What does Portia think?
I remember sitting on a plane to CES maybe 2 years ago, and I sat next to an engineer coming from Europe, from one of the major car companies, and I said, "Tell me about this self-driving car thing. I mean, how fast?" He said, 2022, they'll be everywhere. 2022. I thought, really? That doesn't look like it's about to happen. But so I think it's really hard to predict. But I think what we don't realize is it's sort of creeping into our lives and work all the time, bit by bit. That's good news, though, right? Because it means we can have time to adjust and think and reskill. It's not going to sort of fall out of the sky like a giant anvil on our head, hopefully.
Yeah. So you think like 30 years?
I wouldn't say 30. Our president, Brad Smith, recently put out a blog on sort of the top 10 tech issues for the decade, since we're at the beginning of a decade. And I do think over the next decade, we can probably expect to see some significant shifts. And in individual jobs and industries, we can see that. But I do also want to point out, we've seen shifts like this before. I mean, think about automation and factories. I mean, those have created major shifts and changes in our economy. I think the good thing is now we actually have a lot better data if we want to try to collect it and harness it and think about it and use it to be able to understand what's happening in a more real-time way, to understand it across the country, understand it across the world. And hopefully we can use that data to help us figure out what to do next.
So I realized I was just saying when we get to X, but what do you, when you're talking about this change that we're going to see in AI and where we'll be in a decade, or what are you thinking? Like, what will be the difference in how we operate?
Well, I think that I was thinking back on this. I think to where I was 10 years ago, thinking about the scale of change, I think in some ways is easier if you look back, right? 2010. I didn't have a smartphone. I had to explain to my children that I had this flip phone, and if you press the number 6 times, you could get to the letter F, but that might be a capital F, maybe you want a small f. And then they just looked at me like, that system doesn't make any sense. I don't know what you're saying. But think about that gap. And now I think what is it? Some of the data has said, like, we have 25 times more data now available than we did 10 years ago. Looking forward, can you imagine with 5G computing power that'll be so much faster, with quantum computing, maybe that power being harnessed, and then, multiple exponential folds of data, all those things coming together. I think that's where you're really going to see sort of light year leaps and changes. Will it change sort of how we do our jobs every single day? Sure it will. It may not be that sort of giant size of a change, but the data underlying how we make predictions and assumptions and analyze things, like healthcare is a great example. It's already there. A lot of it's already happening. People are still nurses, and they're still doctors, and they're still physician's assistants. They still have to do those jobs, but the tools they have at their disposal are really different.
Okay, so speaking of data, especially in the healthcare industry, I think it's super exciting for the tech industry. I think it's very exciting when we talk just how we were now, but I think there are also a lot of people that are terrified, or maybe not rightly so, scared of how their data is going to be used, or now they're just aware that people have their data and they didn't think about it before, and now they're wondering how it's being used. How important is educating the public on this? Or how do we even get to a place where we can use that data because there's a general acceptance of using that data, if that makes sense?
So I think, we have these core principles around the use of AI and data, and I think obviously a key one is privacy and security for people, right? They need to feel, part of that's a trust issue. People don't feel that you're going to be a good steward of their data, they're not going to trust you to give it to them. Trust them to give it to you, whichever way it is. I think there can be issues where sometimes people feel like, I have to get it to get this service. So just saying, is it a thumbs up or thumbs down consent? That doesn't really capture the whole world of concerns you have to have when it comes to privacy and data. Absolutely, we do have to do a better job on transparency and explaining how data is being used and what we're using it for. Consumers need to understand that better. But companies also have an important responsibility here to make sure that we're thinking about the perspective of the consumer and of what needs to be done to protect people. We want to unlock the power of data, but at the same time, we have to be respectful and understanding that's coming from real people. It can have real consequences if it gets into the wrong hands, and we have to be responsible in how we think about it and use it.
Yeah, I think going forward, everything will be weaponized. And everything in the past was weaponized too. Or there's always been propaganda. There's always been XYZ, but it didn't move as fast as it does now. So I guess on that kind of thought, what is Microsoft doing, or what do you think big tech companies can do to kind of bring the smaller companies along or bring the public along with the thought that gathering this data is a good thing to be doing?
Well, it's so interesting you use that term weapons, because the president of our company just wrote this book called Tools and Weapons, right? And I don't know if you've ever read that.
I wasn't thinking about that.
I don't know you ever read that Robert Frost poem? It's actually kind of humorous about how like a guy accidentally steps on his garden hoe and it comes up and smacks him in the face, right? So it's a tool, but it can be used to harm as well, and everything's like that, right?
Yeah.
Everything that's powerful could be used for incredible good as well as harm, and so but that choice should be with us, and that's why some of these ethical principles and thinking from the beginning are so incredibly important. And I think that's, a lot of these tools that are being developed are not being developed at big companies like Microsoft, right? There are app
Yeah.
developers everywhere, every day coming up with new things. Certainly, I think we think that having questions like ethics and design impacts, a part of tech curriculum sort of all the way going up is one place to start, where Microsoft is a huge proponent of K through 12 computer science education, of tech education, no matter what field you're in. But that shouldn't just be how do we do this without thinking about its impact in the world. I do think small companies, individual designers. We recently acquired GitHub as well, which is a huge, wonderful community of diverse thinkers and developers. But we just all need to be cognizant of that. And that's, I think, true of tech, but that's been true of everything sort of in the world, right? Like ethics and good choices are on all of us as individuals, as well as communities, companies, societies, government.
Yeah. In terms of, data, things being weaponized, AI leads to facial recognition. There's obviously a lot of activity in the States now on kind of how it's being used by law enforcement and like smaller tech companies developing a way to use AI to facial recognition to find people, like that sort of thing. But what do you think is the right balance between regulatory action on that sort of stuff and moving forward with the innovation on it? Seems like a very cliche question, I guess, but I think on the facial recognition question specifically, there are a lot of people in our community that are terrified because the implications for them in underrepresented communities is real right now versus someone who is recognized and picked up by any sort of AI is not that worried about it, doesn't even recognize that it's a huge issue. But in terms of like recruiting, for example, or things like that, I think that's one area where there are just two totally different conversations happening.
Right. And I think, so I'm one of those people, in Outlook, like there's the room to put a little picture. Like I'm one of those people who doesn't put their picture in there, even though I work at Microsoft. So I understand the fears and concerns. I have like a strong privacy libertarian streak in me myself. But we actually got out on record on this. We did, our president did a speech at Brookings, I guess, over a year ago, almost a year and a half ago, saying, we need to regulate on facial recognition. And at the time, I think people thought it was a little funny, like, well, who are you? You're not the ones like throwing up, millions of videos every day. You're not. But it's because I think because we've been around for a little while, we recognize what can happen as there's innovation super important, but people want to innovate where there are rules of the road. If we as humans who want to run an ethical and just society think, okay, these uses are okay, these uses are not, we need to say that because people will develop all kinds of things, but we need to make a decision as a society and give people those guidelines about those uses. I do think it's hard because tech goes so fast. Government is never fast. Government in the United States in particular, and federal government, is envisioned as a system of limited powers, right? The powers reserved to the states. So Europe, I think, has already started moving down some of these paths, but they also have a different understanding of civil liberties and a different place where they would draw the line in terms of state power and individual power. So we really need to continue this conversation. It's difficult this year. There's a lot going on in Washington. We've got a presidential election. There are a lot of things, but I am encouraged that people are having the conversation, and we need to figure out, some people say stop, just don't do it. That might be an interim step, but we're going to have to tackle these tough questions and say, how can we have beneficial uses of the technology and fair uses and guard against the problematic ones?
As someone who has been, just with your background, I think it's fascinating now with all the issues that are coming up. Do you think there is general consensus leaning towards kind of where Microsoft came out on facial recognition?
I wouldn't presume to say, sure, we think everyone agrees with us, of course. I do think...
well, your perspective is different than
we voiced a concern that I think a lot of people have. I guess I'll just put it that way. What's the right answer? I don't think we would be the ones to say, oh, we know exactly how the line should be drawn and how it should be dealt with. We just want to say, we know a lot based on our experience and on developing the technology about the kinds of questions that will come up and what needs to be addressed. We want to work with policymakers to figure out how do you answer those questions? How do you put things in place? And sometimes that's through lawmaking. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's through, agency internal policy manuals. Sometimes, a lot of these rules are getting set in the private sector by just what corporations are doing. So I think we felt it was important to say, look, we need to think about the right frameworks. If lots of healthcare companies or retail companies who may be using, facial recognition in their stores, if private sector companies are using it a certain way, we want to make sure people are being thoughtful about that too. That may not be a subject for regulation, but it certainly should be a subject of at least conversation.
Yeah. In terms of that, state versus federal regulation or even regulation at all, I think it's really important to also think about the role that, like, grassroots is my campaign background coming in, but advocacy and education play as well, like public education in terms of just, there's obviously public policy and needing to talk to regulators and lawmakers, but how important do you think it is to kind of bring the public along, and how does Microsoft tackle that?
Oh, I think that's everything. Because we're one voice talking to lawmakers, but really they want to hear from people. What's happening in the world? Especially if there are negative impacts on people, they want to understand how the technology is being applied. And for that, you really need a lot of people to engage and just a lot of information. I think that's what's a little bit hard about it now. And we're very engaged in some efforts in Washington State that is actively considering these questions about government use of facial recognition, private sector use, and other privacy issues, you just need a multiplicity of voices to understand all the different impacts that technology can have. Okay. So I would encourage people to be very active, share your experience. I think for smaller companies, for individual developers, coming forward and just talking about how they see these things developing from their perspective. Maybe they're saying we're concerned about innovation being stifled. Maybe they're saying we're really worried about these impacts. We're seeing impacts where people aren't being thoughtful. That's important to share too.
Yeah. I obviously believe that bringing people together and having conversations and just starting a dialogue is one way to, the ROI from just seeing you guys meeting and the amount of connections that have been made is awesome. But what are like a couple of other suggestions you have just for people who are looking to get their word out?
Well, I think the great thing about social media now is you have an automatic voice, right? You don't have to get an editorial published in the paper to be able to put your opinion out there. I do think, and I'm actually recently becoming involved with a nonprofit that thinks about how do we empower women to engage more in civic processes and democratic processes, particularly women who are maybe from some disadvantaged backgrounds. It's important for everyone to sort of feel empowered to share those views. I do think industry associations or local chambers of commerce, other local groups can be really helpful because for a lot of people they say, well, I know my experience, but I don't know where to go or who to talk to about it. And actually at Microsoft, we work with a bunch of our smaller partners and customers called Voices for Innovation. And that's exactly what we do. We sort of help them broker and understand the DC process. Come in on these days, we'll walk around with you, we'll set up meetings for you. Then you guys talk about your concerns and your experience. And I think that's a powerful role that associations and other groups can play.
Okay, I have about 1.5 more questions, so I want you guys to be thinking about yours, and then we have 2 handhelds. I think they both work. We can pass those around. But I guess the other one is just inequity and the digital divide, and how is Microsoft tackling that issue? Because I think that's one other one where a lot of people talk about 5G, they talk about access, they talk about all the things we're going to be able to do, and then there are a lot of people who are just thinking, what if I can't access that or my kid can't?
I think there are so many things we have to do, and we're doing things that I'm really excited about, but there's so much more. One, of course, is rural broadband access, right? That's something that's super troubling about tech development is, sort of development along the coast. And I can't remember what member said this at a hearing. He said, 5G, forget that. I'd like to have 1G. So we need to recognize a lot of people don't have access to high-speed internet. And then all these things that we're talking about, telemedicine, healthcare, if you're an aging veteran far away and the VA is using telemedicine to deliver your healthcare, well, if you don't have broadband, forget it, you're not getting it. I'm working full time. I know there's free online training to help me get a tech certification that would really help me advance my job. Too bad, can't access it. My school assigns homework that is online. I can't do it unless I stay at school, or my mom drives me to McDonald's or the public library 20 miles away. So all these things. So I think access is one fundamental thing, and we actually have this whole initiative called the Microsoft Airband Initiative, where we're trying to help people get access, map who actually has access in the world, improve that mapping, get grants out, used a host of technologies, including TV white spaces, to deliver broadband at lower cost to people places where, wire might not get for decades, potentially. So I think that's really important. Then I mentioned K through 12 computer science education. I mean, having that access is critical. I'll get the stats a little wrong, but I think it was 10 years ago, there was only a handful of states that actually recognized computer science classes for credit toward high school graduation, right? That's ridiculous. I think we're now at 49 states. So the states have been great. Okay, we're going to recognize high school credit. Some people are going to have, mandatory tech requirement in high school. And then they turn around to us and say, that is great. Where are the computer science teachers? We graduated 100 computer science teachers last year in this country. So they obviously cannot teach all these courses in all these schools. We really need to do a lot to invest in that pipeline all the way. And it doesn't start at K through 12. Hopefully you get that foundation. We know that especially women and minorities, if they take a computer science class in high school, they're like almost 10 times more likely to do that after high school. You're never going to get to that associate's degree or BS computer science degree if you don't get that first piece. So I would say those are two of the things. But then also just thinking about, we have all these grants on artificial intelligence. How do we apply it? You need to make sure those grants are going to people and institutions and researchers who are thinking about impacts on diverse communities and how AI can make a difference for all kinds of things. It's great if it helps you, have more efficient, flight schedules at airports or better hotel booking or whatever. But it needs to think about how can we use this really powerful tool to help encourage equity and benefit everyone.
Yeah, we did one of these drinks and discussions with Jessica Rosenworcel at the FCC, and we talked a lot about the homework gap and kids like taking an entire school bus ride solely to do their homework because they put Wi-Fi in the buses. Anyway, right. I'm sure everybody here is aware, but it's crazy. And it's one thing where I just think it's an issue that is being talked about like completely differently in communities where there needs to be some overlap. So I don't know if you have any suggestions on how to like bring all those communities together, but how do we make people recognize the need more versus just
in the rural space?
Yeah.
Oh, I think people know. I mean, we've got some partnerships with 4-H and Future Farmers America. And like those kids, first of all, they're like the most amazing advocates you would ever meet. But also they're living it every day, right? And there's so much sympathy and understanding here in DC. People really want to do something. So, we've been really encouraged by some of the actions that, Department of Agriculture is taking. FCC is obviously taking a look at these things. It's just important. Sometimes people say, well, here's the problem. We have to connect it to 3 steps away. What is the policy piece? What's the funding piece? We're getting internet service providers to think about these markets. And I think we see our role as Microsoft is encouraging those things, doing some of that thinking, help to connect some of those dots and some of those players.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions because we usually go way over. So I just want to be cognizant of time. If you can just say your name, your organization, if you feel comfortable, and your question, and then hand the mic back to Ginny.
And Eric's going to help too. Or Eric. Yeah.
Thanks. Good evening. My name is Sarah Robinson. Thank you so much for all of this. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm a consultant, and I am sort of deep in cybersecurity, data privacy matters. I'm particularly interested in sort of your and Microsoft's position on the do not sell provision of the California Consumer Protection Act. It makes things very difficult for all sorts of people, but it does give individuals an avenue of recourse to try and claw back a little bit about their personal information. And then the latter part of the question is, what are your thoughts on its enforcement as this becomes more of a national and international conversation?
I am going to be a bad answer of this question because we actually have a whole team that works specifically on, California state law. I manage mostly the federal law. We have a whole separate state government affairs and policy team. I will say we think, so I'll answer it in a general way. Think there's some great things about the California law. Think that also some of the ways it's looking at businesses may miss certain kinds of integration in the way businesses are put together, but I couldn't speak to it more specifically. I think we think it's got important pieces, but there's definitely room for improvement, and we need to think about what some of those pieces are. Sorry, that's the best answer I can give you, because I wouldn't be, and I'm not avoiding it. It's like I literally have colleagues who could answer it much better than I can, and I wouldn't give you a very good answer.
Thank you. My name is Natalie. I work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And my question is, so your portfolio deals specifically with U.S. issues, so you may try and dodge this one as well. Not dodge. I mean, that was a little bit harsh, but it may be you have international colleagues. And I'm curious about how you work with those international colleagues when you're thinking about U.S. policy and Microsoft's role as an international company that's facing regulatory environments that may differ really markedly if we look at like the U.S. versus the EU or regulation in Asia, and how you think about creating a cohesive strategy for the company and working with those colleagues in navigating those environments.
Sure. I mean, we have European government affairs colleagues. We have people in Asia, all across the world, where they all come together, and the state government affairs is really corporate headquarters, right? Corporate headquarters sets the policy and the thinking. We have a huge, for example, on privacy, a huge privacy and regulatory affairs division. Actually, Julie Brill, former FTC commissioner, heads that whole division for us, and she is thinking about what happens in California? What happens with GDPR? What do we advance in terms of federal legislation? So that's where the coordination is. Is it challenging? Of course. And, we are operating globally. I do think we recognize that because we're operating globally, for example, when the GDPR was passed, we said we're going to have to comply with this, and we're going to comply with it basically across the board, because it's really hard to start differentiating among different customers. Honestly, it's more work to try to do that and segment them. And what about your customers that have operations in multiple countries? How do you help them? That is one of the reasons we've been pushing for a comprehensive federal privacy standard in the United States. It's not that we don't want to comply with California or other states, but it's going to start getting really difficult pretty quickly. There's one over here.
Hi, my name is Ugoma, and I work with the Center for Global Development, and I'm currently working on an initiative that focuses on how do we govern data in a way that promotes economic growth while still protecting against the misuse of personal data. And so we're trying to design a framework for this. And so I'm curious to hear about Microsoft's data governance strategies as well internally and both externally.
So I think that's a great question. I will also say I feel like it's really important to have robust data governance regimes, but there's also a little bit of a tension, like going back and forth, right? Saying, okay, at some level, we want to have open data because a democratization of data can help everyone. And frankly, I think a lot of people coming from smaller companies or disadvantaged groups might be saying, it's a problem when the data is too locked up, because then we can't access it. We can't get the benefits of it. So we definitely have some initiatives that we're working on, and especially with government data, I think that's a little bit easier, where it's, NOAA surveys or other things that really the taxpayer paid for. So how can we figure out how to make that available to help people, and to your point about democratization and making sure different groups can have access to that data. I think every company has its thoughts about how to, appropriately govern data of its customers. And one of the things we think about as Microsoft is often it's not our data, right? We have a lot of enterprise customers. It's their data about their customers. And so trying to think about a governance regime that's not just about us. It's not our data. I don't know what's in that box. I don't know what that hospital's collecting or whatever. And part of our sort of privacy understanding with them is we are not going in as a company just because you're storing on our cloud. We're not going in and mining it or using it for other things, right? It's you have it, but it does mean that sort of each of those customers has to think about governance. And this is where I do think, this is where government is an important player here, right? We have health privacy standards in this country. But do they need to be updated, right? HIPAA was developed at a certain time where they were only thinking about certain players playing on the field. They're different players. It doesn't. I don't know where it says like what's an app and is that a covered entity, right? So there's a lot that needs to be done. I think that where government and policy making does have an important role.
Hi, my name is Kevin Bryan. I'm a consultant here in DC. Just wanted to ask, actually want to follow up on that question, and then go off on a tangent for a little bit. You talked a little bit earlier about equity, and we talked about the importance that that issue is bringing to Microsoft, and you want to think more about how to be more effective in that space. I guess I'm curious, and you talked about some of the activities that are going on, some of the actions that are being taken, and the fact that we need more dialogue there. Are there some principles that are beginning to emerge from Microsoft, from other tech companies that are actually talking about what equity looks like? For instance, around the issue of AI. Are there some principles that are beginning to emerge out of some of the dialogues that are already taking place?
I think so, but it is sort of, I'll say two things. I think it's sort of nascent. I think some of those conversations are sort of procedural too, right? Because the part of the issue of having AI and algorithms saying they're taking in data, they're learning, they're designed different ways, there probably needs to be some way of saying, okay, you don't just look at what you were thinking on the front end, you also have to look at what comes out on the back end. So I do think there are a lot of people thinking about that, about algorithmic fairness or algorithmic bias, as it may be, and how do you create the structures for that. I still think it's sort of in its beginning stages, but part of what I think is going to happen also is people are going to start developing these principles more deeply in specific areas of application. And I think that will happen in part because that's where you have actual data, you have actual test cases, and I'll go to employment because that's the area I know best, right? People think about hiring and screening algorithms and how are they applied. Well, the EEOC has a bunch of guidelines for disparate impact already, right? Like what is a back-end result that looks like something might not be right, right? So there is also an existing framework of equity in that existing area of law. So then I think that helps people a little bit to try to then figure out, you don't have to build all the principles. You've got some principles that exist in the law already. Now you can build some around how does the technology get applied in this area. But it's still something that I think is super important. And that is why I think some of the, people sometimes say, oh, these commissions or these government bodies, this general agency guidance, that's still so general. You got to start somewhere, and we've got to kind of get those more general frameworks and then sort of try to dig in more deeply. A lot of companies probably are doing some things like what Microsoft is doing is also, we have kind of a standing internal body saying, here are different applications. We kind of have to evaluate them as we come because it's hard for us. Things are changing every day. We can't know today what is going to be the question that is posed tomorrow.
Or how someone will use what you develop.
Right, exactly. We didn't even think of it. Somebody else thought of it.
Yeah, weaponization. I left out a lot of really important topics because you guys had such great questions, so don't be shy about going into a totally different tangent if you want to in your question.
Hi, my name's Tiffany. I had a question regarding the recent FTC attention on the top 5 tech companies and their acquisitions below 90 million, and just kind of how you might see the relationship between big tech and emerging tech changing as the FTC might pay more and more attention to the monopolistic tendencies of the tech industry.
And I'm sorry, who are you with, Tiffany?
I'm with the government.
Thanks. I don't want to comment on the specific letter request we got from the FTC because we did get one, and that has been reported in the press, and will of course be responsive to the agency. I'll answer it kind of more broadly. Microsoft sort of,
or like the end of your question too.
Yes,
like
Microsoft has been down this road before about dealing with concerns. I do think I see something happening. There are questions that could be had about like actual monopolies or concerns about dominating markets. I think, though, there's also something else embedded in it, which is a concern about tech and how big not only individually companies can be, but sort of how pervasive it is. And I don't know that that's always just about Microsoft or Google or Amazon. It's also about how it's everywhere in our lives and taking up all this data like that people are asking about. And frankly, as a consumer, I'm not, a lot of my fears aren't, did this company have it or that company had it? Does somebody have it, right? And what are they going to do with it and who are they going to give it to? So I do think, certainly we see the scrutiny. We know that there are a lot of questions coming from Congress and from federal agencies. We do our best as a company to answer them, to try to be transparent. And that's our job, is to try to do that. But I think different people have different ideas about how business should be structured, and until there are sort of federal law changes or other legal actions, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. But we're not. I don't think we take those fears and concerns lightly.
I thought the end of her question was really interesting too, just like the general relationship between emerging technology and big tech. Do you see like a big change in kind of how those two work together?
I think emerging technology is really everywhere, right? Like everyone, so many of these big tech companies, right? Like they did start in someone's garage, right? Today's tiny little startup is tomorrow's multi-billion-dollar company. I mean, that's the amazing thing about technology, is great ideas can take off and amazing things can be built super quickly. So we certainly at Microsoft don't think we have any kind of monopoly, and I mean that in a general sense, not in a legal sense, on good ideas or developing technology. And frankly, a lot of our work over the years and decades has been working with a lot of partners to do that and to support that work.
Hi, I'm Victoria. Thank you for this, and thank you for having us. I'm with Cisco, and oh, good, she smiled. That's great. I know my company, and I'm sure, and I know your company as well, has to think a lot about security. And now security isn't one thing, it's just everywhere, and we have to kind of embed it in everything we're thinking about. Can you maybe share your thoughts on how you guys at Microsoft, or how I guess our industry thinks about security, and what are sorts of the things that we as consumers should think about, and where that kind of falls in the government space as well? That was a toss-up. You can do whatever
there's
you
a
want with
lot
security.
there. First of all,
let's talk about security.
love partnering with Cisco. I think that's terrific. I do think security is sort of one of those things like ethics that it's got to be at every stage, right? When you're thinking about tech these days, it can't be, oh, we did all this, we're done, about to go to market, ooh, let's think about security, right? That cannot happen. I think one of the good things about being a company that's done a lot to serve enterprise customers over the years is we think about it a lot because we have to. I mean, those customers expect it. That data, everything they have, it's proprietary. It's super valuable to them. We must make that a top priority. And so, we try to do that. Are we always trying to learn and improve? Absolutely. I do think there's more that can be done. As we see ransomware, nation-state attacks, all kinds of different attacks. There's just so many more different kinds of cyber attacks than there used to be in the past. And having some kind of, first of all, Microsoft is, looking to see if there can be global cyber agreement. We've been very interested in this thing called the Paris Agreement, not to be confused with climate. But thinking about how can we work with other countries to have global cyber norms. That's super important. This is something we're all facing. And frankly, a lot of those attacks are coming from outside US boundaries. How can we work together? So we're really interested in that. We do think there's a super important role for government, also for law enforcement, right? Something, especially some of these like smaller, consumer scams or other things. It's so terrible when people say, I went and reported it to my local police department, and they said, well, what am I going to do about this, right? Someone's just been defrauded out of $600 or $1,000. That is a lot of money to them, but the local law enforcement has no way of figuring out how to pursue that. So, I think there's cybersecurity and cybercrime risks along a whole host of levels. It's really important that industry work together, and also government and law enforcement has a really important role, and we have to be able to be cooperative to be able to share information, of course, in an appropriate way that doesn't freak out customers about losing their privacy or other individuals, but figuring out how to share those learnings so we can, move forward, prosecute, and also stop the attacks. A lot of the time, just getting it to stop is a huge benefit because it can protect hundreds or thousands of other people who might otherwise be hurt.
Education of the public is super important there,
Yes,
too.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Others? You can give yours to him if you want.
Hi. So I'm a machine learning engineer. One thing about machine learning and data science is that it's really particular in just how we discuss things about information and probability, and we have a lot of quantitative ways of talking about things. So I'm curious, with your experience as a lawyer studying ethics and history and I guess philosophy, how would you want us to have that kind of discussion and be able to be part of the conversation about fairness and ethics with AI?
So first of all, really welcome it. I mean, you are the folks who are actually, designing things and making decisions. I do think that's where sort of talking back and forth across disciplines is so important, right? Because when I say a word, I may think it means something. You may hear something totally different, or I may misunderstand. You're using something incredibly precisely, and I'm not understanding. I'm using it in sort of a plain English way, and that's how a lot of miscommunication can happen, I think. And a lot of what we do and what our team does here in DC, being in government affairs, is just sort of that day-to-day education. We go up to staff, they say, I'm confused. How is AI being used in healthcare settings to help diagnose breast cancer? You get a technical expert on the phone and say, this is what happens. We went through it. We learned these things. We looked at it. We realized the machine learning was actually picking up, the notes the physician wrote in the corner. So we needed to control for that, right? You need to, really walk people through in a granular way and sort of educate each other about the vocabulary we're using. But I think really one of the most important things is to have folks with your background participating. Something we've been doing internally in the company a lot is I work in a part of the company that's sort of the legal affairs division, and having kind of lawyers work closely with different product teams. It can be a little hard sometimes because people feel like they don't really understand each other and they're thinking, well, that person is like they're from Mars. But they really learn a lot over time, and I think that's how we can really develop stronger approaches, is by having those people of your background and a lot of diverse backgrounds in the conversation.
Thank you for being here. That was the point
That's really
of
great.
the bridge. Go for it.
Oh, there's
Hi, Katerina Sadova. I'm a Tech Congress Fellow with Senate Homeland Security and a recovering Microsoft engineer.
So you should be doing this, giving this talk.
Oh, no. My question is about Microsoft's international engagement. In particular, some of the issues that you brought up with the disruptive effect that AI may have, at least temporarily, until the society adjusts and learns how to embrace it and change how we think about workforce issues. How is Microsoft as a company, a global company, but still a private sector company, engaging on an issue that is generally reserved to the domain of governments and nation-to-nation kind of dialogue? And do you have the right, do we have internationally as a system the right mechanisms in place, the right places to engage the private sector that has been the battlefield and the victim and in many ways the target of so many issues in technology that nation states are engaging in?
Let me try to answer your question. I think, first of all, we do engage with sort of bodies, right? Like the EU Commission, with the UN, with the WTO, with ILO, with all kinds of these sort of international bodies. But you're right. We're not like a member nation state. And I definitely think working on this Paris Accord on cybersecurity has been one example. Frankly, after the Christchurch shooting, working with New Zealand, Australia, other governments to say, okay, private sector has a role here, governments have a role here. I do think we've proposed some ways that the two can work together. Is it? It might be like a mini tentacled octopus sometimes, right? But I think that's part of the nature of international engagements. There are a lot of stakeholders, and we recognize it's not just tech either, right? It needs to be civil society, it needs to be other groups who are heard, we do try to engage it. You know, I'd have to talk to folks who deal more on the international side to say, do we really have the right structures in place? You know, maybe there are improvements that could be made there. But I think you're asking a very astute question, because these questions aren't individual and national a lot of the time. Some of them are very individual and national, like the gap in workforce and skills, for example. And there, one of the challenges is being a multinational company, but having people ask in Cape Town or Tokyo or Sydney, can you help me with this problem right here, right? And we have a corporate philanthropic arm that does that. Our colleagues at LinkedIn, I see Nicole Isaac here from LinkedIn. Hi, Nicole. You know, they have a global reach as well, right? So providing things like their economic graph analysis, you know, understand what does our regional or local labor market look like, can be super helpful for people. So we try to engage sort of locally as well, but there is an important role for those international dialogues.
Everywhere. You can give it to someone up here, and then we can just go over.
Hi, Heather Ashby. I'm a consultant with Homeland Security. And so my question was the role of a company like Microsoft in election security, and whether you could explain some more about the Defending Democracy initiative that the company's working on.
Ginny, since you're the director of that, do you want to answer that question?
Well, thank you for that question. It would look like I plan to do. So we have a program focused on defending democracy, where we focus on three primary issues: election security, campaign security, and disinformation defense. And the origin of it, I won't spend the whole time doing a spiel, but just to give you a sense of why we did that. We, of course, had people at the company prior to the 2016 elections that were working on those issues, but they were happening in more traditional silos as were relevant to particular customers. And what we discovered is that, well, on one hand, we felt like the tech companies had a responsibility to step up when it came to these crucial issues. And we recognized that we needed a team to work across company and have strategic vision around how we tackled them. Because while we were doing good things in these smaller silos, it wasn't driving towards a broader impact. So we created a team to do that. As far as how we actually engage in those areas, it's a combination of policy work, but also services, software. We've tried to identify where Microsoft is unique, or where we have something unique to add, whether it's our position as a bullhorn. You know, if we can shout loudly about an issue that we think is problematic, that small election officials don't have the voice to do that, then that's one thing that we can bring to it. Or if we have technology that can help secure political campaigns, but it's too expensive, so we can work out both through policy means, but as well as with our internal teams to make it more affordable and easier to access. That's the kind of thing that we do as well. Happy to talk to you about it more. I have a passion, so I could talk for a whole hour about it. But thanks for the question. And now I'll hand it over to Andrew.
We've hosted a couple of events with Ginny on this, and there is one video on our website on that events page, which I can send you to if you're interested in watching it. I don't know. It's long.
Hi, so I'm Andrew Luckett. I'm with the Data Coalition. You talked about government data, and there's clearly an interest within government to better utilize data that it already collects, with whether it's the Open Government Data Act that passed last year or the release of the Federal Data Strategy. But those are decade-long implementation timelines. So I'm wondering, from kind of a more dynamic industry perspective, can you offer kind of insight into what could be short-term goals or short-term wins within government that can be tackled to not only bolster morale around these kind of issues, but also keep it top of mind within government?
Sure. Well, first of all, I haven't looked at all the things, but I think there's a lot also in the president's suggested budget around these lines as well. And although I know there's some folks who are saying that's not going anywhere, I think it's an important signal, right? Like, everyone realizes, for efficient functioning of government, the government has a lot of data. Let's figure out how to use it. I think there are a lot of, and here I'll speak to, these are needs at the federal government. That's the place I know best, but I'm sure the needs are even greater at the state and local, right? Because they have far fewer resources. But it's everything from helping people get paper records into electronic form. I mean, that is so huge for so many agencies. DHS, I think, still hasn't really moved to electronic processing of visas. So, they still do a lot of programs by paper. So, I mean, it's such a huge waste of time and frankly, so demoralizing for staff who are already so overworked and taxed to think about how, basic things like, computerizing records. I remember when I was at the Department of Labor, we had a mandate from Congress to look across a bunch of different programs and see how outcomes were, for example, for individuals with disabilities, disadvantaged youth, adults with barriers. And then we went back and said, okay, states, you have to report it all through a portal. And some of the states said, we can't do that. We can't do that. We don't have the means. And so we went back and said, well, let's ask them. How are they collecting their data now? How can they figure out outcomes? So we get on a call, and some people say, well, we just have this Excel spreadsheet, and we populate them one by one. It was a state with a smaller population, so they were only talking, several hundred or several thousand people they were serving, but still, right? Like, those are the kinds of things that are happening. I think, frankly, this isn't even about future innovation, just using the products that are available today to help agencies unlock the power of data. And that's a lot of what we do sort of on the customer-facing side with federal government and state and local government agencies, is saying, did you know you could use SharePoint to help you revise those documents and clear them instead of a paper clearance system, which is what we still had 4 years ago when I was at a federal agency, of writing edits by hand on memos and someone would walk them from office to office. There are a lot of things that, Power BI can help you. You've got the data in there. Here are 17 different ways you can now display it for your report that you need to give to the state legislature at the end of each term. There's a lot that's out there in terms of tools. It's just helping customers unlock it, I think. Those are the short-term wins. You're right. There are easy short-term wins there. There's a lot more that can be done in terms of broader data and data sharing. I mean, I think this is part of the problem. A lot of agencies can't share their data from agency to agency. So, figuring out what things would be useful with appropriate privacy protections, of course, is super important. Immigration's another good example. You would have 4 stages in the process. Each sub-agency had a different form and a different database, and they couldn't talk to each other. So if your application was lost in the way, you could never find it. Hopefully it's fixed. Still working on it. Work in progress.
See one more back there. It is. If anyone else has one, raise your hand and we can give you the mic.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm with Decode. So piggybacking off of Andrew's question, you said that the technology to transform paper documents into electronic records already exists today. So do you think that is a policy problem, or do you think that's a acquisitions and procurement problem?
So something I learned while in an agency is they're not really different, right? Yeah, there's plenty of challenges in acquisitions and procurement, but part of that is what's the priority for the agency, right? And a lot of it, of course, is funding. But and you need to prioritize to say lots of agencies have hundreds of thousands, millions of documents warehoused somewhere. Of course, you suddenly get more capability. You have to prioritize what's the most important, right? Maybe it's going forward. Maybe going back will take forever. Maybe it's only going back 5 years. Whatever it is, you do have to prioritize in your procurement and decide how you're going to use scarce resources. So I think it's both. But a lot of it is people, in the government, a lot of people have been in the government, don't necessarily know all the capabilities that tech has, so they don't even know to ask to seek to procure some of these things. And that's partly our job. We need to do that education, and we were trying to do a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of progress in the federal government, a lot of eagerness to try to unlock these solutions.
It also goes the other way. I think a lot of people in tech have no idea that all the paper forms you were just talking about, that still exists, or that when you talk to, even when we did election security, a lot of our conversation was around two-factor authentication, because that's where a lot of education is now around cybersecurity, which if you've been in cybersecurity, that was 10, decades ago.
Did you take that phishing training yet?
Yeah, exactly.
Again?
But I think it goes kind of both ways on that. So I know we had one more here, and then it is 7:15, so snacks after this.
Okay, I'll be quick.
No worries.
I don't know if this is your area, but you can orient me. Most recently, I was working at the World Bank on the disruptive technologies agenda, and now I'm consulting with a think tank based in California that works with Latin America. So their concern is they're sitting down thinking what are the issues, what are the areas of technology that Latin American economies should be thinking about in terms of future development. So if we can only concentrate on a few programs, like what should be the pillars? What are the key areas that, so they're thinking biotechnology, but that's one, and there's so many others. And so in terms of advising them on what are key areas, and you're thinking about a small organization that really wants to zero in on key areas, like key issues.
First of all, we have a fabulous Latin American colleague who handles Latin American government affairs, who would know far more about this than I. It's not my area. Nicole might handle some of the LATAM. She might oversee some of the LATAM, like kind of what's happening in terms of big picture shifts in demographics and workforce from the LinkedIn side. I do think we have to. These questions are very localized, so I can't really speak to them. But what one has to look at is sort of what are some of those opportunities, what are the resources that are there, what are the sort of potential niches for individual companies, or I'm not sure I'm
I guess I was
answering
thinking
your
the
question.
trends, how do you transfer, like the trends that are important here in the US are going to actually extend globally, right? They'll face different challenges in different markets, but those are not just localized, they're not just US focused, right?
Yeah, that's true. But in some ways, I think, for example, the regulatory regimes in different countries lead to different kinds of innovations and different kinds of incentives. So, right, like if you go to Europe, there's a lot of consternation sometimes around European colleagues saying, like, look at these huge startups from China, look at them from the US. What are the ones from Europe? And I can't remember, I was at a presentation where somebody showed where you could see Google Street View. And it's basically all these areas except for Germany and Russia or something like that, right? Like they were saying, like, look, we just don't, because of certain governing regimes, we haven't had the same kind of innovation. And people may think that's good or bad. I've also seen entrepreneurs who talk about India and they say, you know what, this is amazing. We are doing such great stuff on women and cervical cancer, and we're going to bust this wide open because we go and we do these free tests and people will sign away their privacy and data for free because they don't have any access to medical care. So giving them that care, they are so willing to do it because they're thinking, what is it going to hurt me? So you may see amazing breakthroughs in terms of health knowledge and cures in those areas because there aren't some of the same safeguards that we have here. So I think it's a little hard to, I wouldn't necessarily generalize to say what's going to be the cutting edge leading trend in the US is definitely going to be the one in those countries. I do think places like the US and China and some of the European countries are making big investments in areas that will take a longer time to pay off. And I'm thinking specifically of, say, quantum computing, right? And that might be that once we've made that progress, other countries can say, that's great. Glad we can take those learnings. So, I think that's the job of some of us that have a really very developed research infrastructure to continue to do that work.
I think they're on the right track. They're focusing a lot on STEM education for young people.
Yeah, and again, because people might have different barriers, they may come out ahead of us in terms of innovative solutions, right? We may be very wedded to bricks and mortar school and a certain way of doing things. In a country where that infrastructure isn't as developed, they said, you know what? We had to figure out a totally different way. We may have leapfrog ahead of you in terms of rural broadband. And we saw that certainly with mobile technology, right? A lot of countries that were sort of faster adopters, faster app developers along certain dimensions because they didn't have the same, telephone in every home that we had that people were used to.
I think that's a good topic for our next.
Can I do a closing remark? Is it okay? So this whole conversation reminded me a lot of, there was this like really cliched thing that people said all the time in the 80s. They felt like every business speech people would say, they were like, the Chinese word for crisis is danger and opportunity put together. Did you guys hear that a million times? Yeah, see, some of you know. But anyway, I think it's, what's old? The 80s are new again, right? So, but this moment really makes me think of that, is that it is, there are some scary and potentially dangerous things, but there's also tremendous opportunity to unlock, and it's sort of on all of us to sort of keep rowing in that direction. If there are things that we think are important, we got to put our values out there and make sure that the tech is shaped by our values, right? It's not invented by Martians. It's invented by us. We're people, and we can shape this and drive it the way we want to, but we do have to work together to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good follow-on to what you were asking about the world trends, because I think our values here in the U.S. will drive a lot of the future. Talk about U.S. China is one we didn't even get into, but Anyway, that's a topic for another time. But thank you guys so much for coming. Thanks for the great questions. The bar and food, I think, will be out until 8, so feel free to stick around. I know that Portia and I will both be here. And if you are not part of the Bridge community, go to thebridgework.com/join. I remembered. And join and come back again, be part of these conversations. And please tell a friend, we are growing organically, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.